There's a version of Route 66 that America decided to sell to the world. The open road, the chrome diners, the neon signs cutting through desert dark. The idea that freedom has a specific shape, and that shape is asphalt stretching west until you can't go any further. That version exists. It's real enough. You can still drive pieces of it, still stop at the places that survived, still buy the postcard. But there's another version. One that never made it onto the postcard. In 1956, the federal government passed the Interstate Highway Act and began building a network of high-speed roads that didn't just run parallel to Route 66. They made it structurally unnecessary. The new interstates were faster, straighter, and deliberately routed to serve larger population centers. The towns along the old alignment didn't receive warnings. They didn't receive alternatives. The bypass just happened, and the traffic that had sustained entire local economies for 30 years simply stopped arriving. This isn't a story about nostalgia. It's not a celebration of roadside Americana or a lament for a simpler time. It's something more specific. A look at 12 communities that were built around Route 66, grew because of it, and were left to collapse when federal planners in Washington decided to draw a different line on a different map. Some of these towns still exist. Some have been reduced to a building or two. Some have been so thoroughly erased that proving they were ever there requires hunting through microfilmed newspapers in state archives. What connects them isn't aesthetics. It's the question that each one raises without fully answering. Who decides which places deserve to keep existing? Glenrio sat on a state line, literally. The main street divided Texas from New Mexico, which meant the town operated across two jurisdictions, two sets of regulations, two county governments. That administrative complexity was actually useful for a while. Texas had stricter liquor laws, so the bars clustered on the New Mexico side. Cheaper gasoline was available across the line depending on tax rates. The town had learned to play its unusual geography to its advantage. At its peak, Glenrio had enough going on to sustain itself. Motels, diners, gas stations, a post office. The kind of place that didn't ask you to stay long but made sure you left with a full tank and maybe a piece of pie. Then I-40 was built several miles to the north, bypassing Glenrio entirely. And what happened next is the part that makes this place particularly strange. Neither Texas nor New Mexico moved with any urgency to preserve or manage what remained. The building sat in jurisdictional ambiguity for decades. Neither state has ever fully resolved who is responsible for the ruins. The structures decay under open sky, neither claimed nor demolished. The state line is still there. You can still find it on the ground. The town on either side of it is gone. Texola is one of those places where the mathematics of decline become almost impossible to comprehend when you stand in front of them. 3,000 people. That's how many lived here during the Route 66 years. Enough for schools, enough for a small commercial district, enough for a community with its own identity and its own internal life. Fewer than 40 people live there now. The physical remnants are still present. An abandoned jail with rusting bars. A gas station pump from the 1930s that stands like a piece of industrial sculpture nobody commissioned. The welcome sign at the city limits still reads, "Welcome to Texola," which is accurate, technically, but doesn't explain what you're being welcomed to. What's unsettling about Texola isn't the decay, it's the scale. The buildings that remain are sized for a town of thousands. The streets were designed for traffic that hasn't come in 60 years. There's a fundamental mismatch between the infrastructure that exists and the human presence it was built to serve, and that mismatch makes the whole place feel slightly off. Like a stage set for a play that closed in 1970 and nobody thought to dismantle. Newkirk is harder to describe than the places before it because it hasn't made the dramatic visual leap into ruin. It still has a zip code. It still appears on official maps. If you look it up, it shows up as an inhabited place. But the school closed years ago. The post office followed. The one commercial structure that remained, a small warehouse, hasn't received a delivery in over a decade. The population, at last count, was somewhere in the single digits or low teens depending on which survey you consult. The state hasn't declared Newkirk abandoned or defunct. That process would require paperwork, administrative procedures, decisions. So instead it persists in this bureaucratic middle state, officially alive, materially hollow. It exists on paper because eliminating it from paper would require more effort than anyone is willing to spend on a place this small. That's the quiet cruelty of it. Newkirk isn't forgotten. It's just not worth the trouble of officially acknowledging what it's become. Some towns decline slowly, over generations, in ways that allow for a kind of gradual adjustment. People leave, children don't return. The population thins across decades until what remains is a much smaller but still functioning version of the original. Alan Reed didn't get that. The bypass came, the traffic stopped, and the population didn't thin. It fell. Photographic evidence from the era captures it with unusual clarity. Main Street in 1965, full and functional. Main Street in 1978, almost entirely empty. 13 years. That's not slow erosion. That's a town watching itself disappear in real time. What remained were mostly people who either couldn't leave or had reasons to stay that outweighed the economic reality. And the structures they left behind, the shuttered storefronts, the service stations with equipment still inside, carry that specific weight of places that were abandoned mid-sentence, not closed down properly, just stopped. Amboy is the strangest case in the first half of this list, and possibly the strangest thing about it is that it keeps generating headlines. The town was sold, the entire town, the Roy's Motel sign that became one of the most photographed images in the Mojave Desert, the gas station, the diner, the post office, a handful of houses, a dormant volcanic cinder cone behind it, sold at auction in 2005 for $425,000, less than the cost of a median home in Los Angeles at the time. The buyer, a businessman from the area, attempted to restore it as a functioning stop and a tourist attraction. The gas station reopened. People came, but living in Amboy, actually residing there, year-round, in a desert where summer temperatures can exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit with no nearby services, proved untenable. So Amboy became something genuinely new. A town that functions as a set piece of itself. People drive the extra miles off the interstate to see Roy's sign, to take photographs in front of the diner, to stand in the middle of the road with nothing in any direction. It's visited. It's just not lived in. It's not. And there's something about that distinction, between a place being experienced and a place being inhabited, that gets at something uncomfortable about what we actually mean when we call somewhere a town. Before the interstate came through, Ludlow solved a problem that the Mojave Desert created constantly: water. In the desert, a reliable water source isn't a convenience, it's infrastructure. Travelers and freight vehicles crossing the Mojave needed stops specifically because the environment demanded it. Heat, distance, mechanical stress. Ludlow had a hotel, a restaurant, fuel, and critically, water. It existed not because of aesthetic choice, but because the desert required it. When I-40 bypassed it and the traffic went elsewhere, the logic that had built Ludlow simply ceased to apply. Without vehicles stopping, there was no economic reason to maintain the water access point. Without the water point, there was no reason to be here at all. The whole structure of the place depended on travelers needing it, and once they stopped needing it, everything unraveled in sequence. The ruins are still there. The desert is methodical. Sun, wind, thermal expansion, contraction, and it takes things apart slowly, but without exception. No agency has claimed responsibility for what remains. It's not designated, not protected, not scheduled for demolition. It just continues becoming less and less recognizable as something human beings built. Two Guns carries history that Route 66 didn't create, but that Route 66's decline helped bury. The site was originally an Apache location. In the 1920s, a man named Harry Miller, who operated under the name Two Gun Miller, established a roadside attraction there. A zoo of sorts, with mountain lions in cages built into the ruins of cliff dwellings. He monetized indigenous archaeology as a novelty stop for passing motorists. The arrangement involved a legal dispute with another man over land rights, which escalated into a killing. The case went to court and produced no conviction. That history was never fully investigated, never fully documented, never officially acknowledged as part of what happened at this site. When Route 66 traffic diminished and Two Guns lost its commercial purpose, it lost whatever fragile attention it had attracted. The ruins of the zoo remain. The cliff dwellings beneath them contain archaeological evidence of occupation that was treated, for a brief commercial moment, as a backdrop for photographs. The town never really existed beyond that attraction, and the attraction only ever existed in the gap between what indigenous history meant to the people who made it and what it was sold as to people passing through. It had a post office. It had a school. It appeared in census records. People who traveled Route 66 in the 1930s mentioned stopping there. But when New Mexico counties began digitizing historical records in the early 2000s, the documents pertaining to Indy, its founding, its land agreements, its administrative history, were not included. The official explanation was physical deterioration of the source materials. Historians who have tried to research the town dispute that explanation. What they've found instead is that the documentary record of Indy's existence is almost entirely held in microfilmed newspapers at a single state library. If you want proof that Indy was real, you have to go find it in analog form, in person. There's a difference between a place being forgotten and a place being difficult to remember. Indy sits in that gap, not destroyed, not preserved, just hovering at the edge of verifiability. Kelso is one of the few places on this list where the collapse was documented with unusual precision, because the institution that created it kept records. The Southern Pacific Railroad built a depot at Kelso to support trains crossing the Mojave. At its peak during World War II, the facility employed hundreds of workers, with a full residential support structure around it. The trains required helper engines to climb the grades, and Kelso was the servicing point. It was a functional industrial community in the middle of the desert, and it existed entirely because of that mechanical necessity. As diesel engines replaced steam, the need for helper engines declined. As freight patterns shifted, the depot's role diminished. Each service reduction was logged. The last residents left on dates that are recorded. The abandonment of Kelso wasn't organic. It was scheduled, in stages, by a corporation managing its own infrastructure. The community wasn't a victim of indifference. It was a line item in a cost reduction process. The depot building itself was eventually restored as a visitors' center for the Mojave National Preserve, which means Kelso now exists as a display of what Kelso used to be, staffed by rangers who explain to visitors what the building once housed. History as exhibit, the town as its own museum. The deeper you go into this list, the more you notice that what makes these places disturbing isn't always the physical state of what remains. Sometimes it's what you can no longer find out. Truxton's Route 66 years were unremarkable in the specific way that matters most. It was a functioning community that served travelers and maintained itself. It had residents, businesses, schools. It had presumably a founding history with documents attached to it. Who platted the land, under what terms, with what agreements. When Truxton's County began digitizing its historical records, the documents covering the town's founding period were not transferred. The official reason given was deterioration of the physical materials. Local historians have noted that this explanation is difficult to verify, because the original materials, which would either confirm or disprove the deterioration claim, are no longer accessible. So there's a gap. A specific bounded gap in the documentary record of a real place. And what fills that gap now is the absence of whatever would have explained in legal and historical terms how Truxton came to exist. Picher didn't decay, it was purchased. The town's economy had been built on lead and zinc mining, deposits that supplied critical war materials through both World War I and World War II. The mines eventually played out, as they do, but the damage they left in the ground did not go away. Decades of mining had left the soil and groundwater contaminated with heavy metals at levels the Environmental Protection Agency eventually classified as beyond remediation. The federal government's response was specific. Rather than attempting to clean the site, it bought the properties. Individual homes, businesses, public buildings, all purchased and vacated as part of a voluntary buyout program. The last family left in 2009 after the decision had been made at the federal level that Picher could not be saved and should not be inhabited. There's something worth sitting with in how that worked. The town wasn't destroyed by a natural disaster. It wasn't abandoned in a moment of crisis. It was methodically depopulated through a bureaucratic process, forms signed, checks issued, properties transferred, then structures demolished. The contamination that made this necessary came from the same industrial extraction that had made the town economically viable for decades. The mines that built Picher were also, all along, dismantling it. Route 66 had already done its damage by then. The bypass had cut traffic decades earlier. But Picher's end came from something more deliberate. A federal agency deciding, based on soil samples and cost projections, that a place should cease to be inhabited. There is a place, or there was a place, that appears in railroad survey maps from the early 20th century. It shows up in a single federal census record from the 1930s. It's mentioned in personal letters written by people who describe, in plain and matter-of-fact language, a community with a name, a school, a general store, and enough of a population to justify those things existing. It has no founding document. It has no record of dissolution. It has no designation, historical, archaeological, or otherwise. The descendants of people who lived there, when they can be located, describe a place that multiple generations have tried and failed to find official confirmation of. They have the letters. They have oral history. They have, in some cases, photographs. What they don't have is a single government record that acknowledges this community as a place the United States formally recognized as existing. It isn't a ghost town. A ghost town implies a previous official existence, an incorporation, a post office designation, a place on a federal map during the years it was alive. This is something different. A community that organized itself, persisted for some years, appeared in the margins of official documents without ever being centered in them, and then disappeared without any administrative record of having done so. The reason this is number one isn't that it's the most visually dramatic or the most historically documented. It's the opposite. It's number one because it represents the end point of the logic that runs through every entry on this list. Glenrio became no one's responsibility. Newkirk remained officially alive without actually living. Ende became nearly impossible to verify. Kelso was scheduled out of existence. Picher was bought and dissolved. But Declaro, whatever it was, whatever name it actually used, in whatever county it occupied, wasn't even given the dignity of an official ending. It simply stopped being a place that the machinery of government acknowledged, and the machinery of government continued without noting the absence. That's the full arc of what Route 66 built and what federal planning dismantled. Not just communities, not just economies. In the end, legibility itself. The right to be the kind of place that, when it's gone, someone is required to notice. The road is still there. Parts of it, anyway. And the tourists who drive it talk about freedom, the open horizon, the vanishing point, the romance of motion. That's not wrong exactly. It's just incomplete. There were people who lived along this road. They built things. Some of them are still standing. Some of them were sold at auction. Some of them are buried in soil too toxic to walk on. And some of them, a few, never made it into any record that can be found. The road goes on. It doesn't carry them with it.